We have a special guest with us today. Cyrus Janssen is a geopolitical analyst, investor, speaker, and social media influencer with well over a million fans across the social media platforms. Born in the US, Cyrus lived abroad for 15 years in China and Canada. This is not his first time on our show. Based in Las Vegas, Nevada. I'm assuming that's where you are right now. Is that where you are, Cyrus?
That is correct.
Have you seen that giant sphere?
I have. I have. It's amazing.
Yeah, Cyrus is the CEO of Fast Forward Marketing, a social media and consulting company helping brands in North America and Asia connect and build successful social media campaigns. And he's an avid lover of golf.
That is true. Thank you, Jason. Great to be back here on the channel.
Yeah, I wanted to open up with what do you think? Because there's a lot of different people, even experts on the Belt and Road Initiative, who have very different ideas of what it is. So, what your assessment? What do you think the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, it's a great question. And I think we need to start with the fact of when the Belt and Road Initiative started. And it was started over 10 years ago. And it really was the key piece for China's foreign policy. I think that's something that many people really need to understand is that when they wanted to revive this Belt and Road, which certainly has some historical ties back to the old ancient Silk Road, this was really going to be Beijing government's key infrastructure plan, but also just its key tool for developing foreign relations around the world. And Jason, that's what you see an incredible amount of development. There's over 150 countries around the world. There's been over $6 trillion worth of deals done. And so it's been, a tremendous success. And it's, there's obviously been some challenges as well with that. But overall, I think that we need to look at the many projects that has been very successful. And I think a good analogy that I've heard is, for example, when you're making investments in the stock market, right? You're not going to put all of your money in one stock. What you're taught is to diversify, right? You probably pick 30, 40 stocks if you're going to do this full time. And if you're going to, let's say if you're managing a hedge fund, you might have 30 or 40 stocks. Well, some are going to be outstanding, some are going to be average, and some are going to be very poor performing. China's done well over 1,100 investments around the world. So sometimes Western media will point out that, hey, this bridge, it was a failure. Yes, well, if you do 1,100 projects around the world, inevitably there's going to be some that fail. There's going to be some that are great success and some probably average. So, but if you look at the sum of all of those projects, it is still a very positive impact. And it certainly is a big success for China over the last decade.
I get a lot of feedback because I post a lot of content where Chinese development aid is going on. And, these are different things. And I want to try to sort some of them out today on the program because there's like development aid and the Belt and Road Initiative. And sometimes the two cross over and sometimes they don't. But I oftentimes show people, oh, China built this hospital for free for this country. And some people will say, oh, nothing's for free, Jason. That is because they want good diplomacy. Yeah, of course they do. That is probably a huge part of it. That's why it's called like the eighth Sino-Bangladesh friendship bridge. The friendship part is the part where they're actually, yeah, of course, they're trying to make a good impression on the people of Bangladesh, on the government of Bangladesh, to have good deals, to have good relations naturally. I mean, that, in fact, I think that that's a really good way to do diplomacy. Imagine if all the most developed countries in the world started doing their diplomacy by giving aid infrastructure to the underdeveloped world all over the place. That would change our world overnight. I wish more countries would do BRI-like things. There's a new project that has been announced in the EU. They say they're going to fund 300 billion euros by 2027 for something called the Global Gateway Initiative.
Okay.
And I don't know if they're actually going to fund it or not, but I hope they do.
Right.
If you're a leader in a developing country and you want a bridge or you want a hospital or you want a school or something, you want options. And that's what China is offering. The AIIB and other parts of China's development infrastructure are offering the developing world more options. Now, if they want to go with World Bank, great. If they don't, if they want to go with AIIB, that's up to them. That is up to the agency of the leaders in those countries who have, like you have pointed out with all of those wonderful statistics, chosen China again and again and again, and sometimes World Bank as well. But it's ultimately up to those countries. What I think is frustrating is when the highly developed West says, whoa, you should not be partnering with China for whatever X, Y, and Z reasons.
Right.
That is patriarchal and it's colonial. And it's basically like the West saying, oh, we know better for what you should be doing. When the leaders of countries in Africa, for example, it should be up to them with whom they partner.
Right. Yeah, absolutely, Jason. And I think that's really the new world that we're seeing right now in geopolitics is the fact that we have shifted from a unipolar world where the United States was the supreme decision maker and truly the global leader. We basically saw that after World War II. After World War II, Europe was completely decimated. The United States had to come in with billions of dollars to rebuild Europe and to invest in Europe, and that's exactly how we saw the birth of the United States dollar being a foreign reserve currency. It was very clear that after World War II, look, you guys are going to start using US dollar in international trade. We're going to create the SWIFT system. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Everything's going to be set up from the United States side. And at that time, there was no other global power that could rise. Obviously, China at that time was very underdeveloped. It was very much in its infancy stages, nowhere close to being, a developing country yet. But that's where the United States had leverage. And we saw that for the next really half century, that we saw the United States really being that unipolar world. And now that's shifted. We saw that as there's an amazing graph that shows which country in the world, this is in 2000, so basically 25 years ago, the United States was the number one trading partner in the world for the vast majority of countries in the world. And then in two decades, that has now been overtaken by China. So China is now by far the number one trading partner for over 120 countries in the world, replacing the United States. So we've seen a huge shift, and that is where countries in the world today, I think, again, I agree with you, I think it's a great thing, because if I am Bermuda or, these smaller, like Bahamas or, these smaller countries, Botswana, Ghana, wherever, Bangladesh, any country in the world, if you're not one of these two major countries, if I'm the prime minister or president, I want to do business with China and the United States. I want to be building, hey, China wants to build me a bridge? Great. The United States wants to provide me some aid? Great. You want to do business? Yeah, I want to have open trade relations with both countries. So I think that's really has been embraced a lot now, especially in the past 2 decades, as we've seen China's rise as the global manufacturer and the number one trading partner for so many countries.
Yeah, I think it's really amazing. And you mentioned the Marshall Plan. What the Marshall Plan did was create the economy of Western Europe such that they could be a major player again in the
Right.
global economy. And that is what China is doing with a lot of the members of the Belt and Road Initiative. By developing ports and roads and rail, they're increasing economic activity in the developing world such that they can become part of the global market in a much larger way and raise prosperity in the developing world in what is sometimes called the global south. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a fantastic opportunity. It's like a new Marshall Plan. Now, not all of it is free, obviously. The vast majority of Belt and Road Initiative projects are financed projects. So that means they're borrowing money, oftentimes at about 2%. I've checked out almost all of the loans I can find are like about 2%. Some
Correct.
of them are more, some of them are 0%. They're
Correct.
0% 20 years. So it's like, if China just bought US treasuries or gold, that's going to increase value. So China is in fact sometimes losing money on these investments. You pointed out sometimes these projects don't work out, and that's true. There's a really good source called Carry that Deborah Brodigan runs at Johns Hopkins University, where they
Yeah.
have a debt relief page, and it shows just billions and billions and billions of dollars that China has restructured or forgiven. And there's not one instance anywhere in the world where China like foreclosed on a foreign national's project. The
Exactly.
the case that people like to bring up in Sri Lanka was actually China giving another loan that then Sri Lanka used to pay Western investors money on
Right.
high interest loans back. So, I mean, it's really misunderstood. There's a really good article on The Atlantic about it. I do want to cover, so people know what we're talking about outside of the abstract, what China does in terms of development aid. And when I say aid, I don't mean finance projects, I mean gifts. So,
Right.
these are just a few examples. China donated $11 million to expand a hospital for Kenya in response by a request by President then Kenyatta. A 5-story facility includes outpatient services, ER, 12 ICU beds, 84 beds, a lab, maternity, operating theater, and equipment. This is one of hundreds of such hospitals that China built around the world as gifts for other countries. Here's another example. This is China spent 13.33 million US dollars to build the Ad Damazin Friendship Hospital for Sudan in 2009. China gave $13.24 million to Liberia to build a hospital in 2010. China gave $31.28 million for a center for children with disabilities in Mongolia in 2019. So these are just some examples of hospital related projects. But China does this in its development aid, developing so these are like schools, hospitals, bridges, roads, and these are free all over the place. Now, does China build hospitals and roads and rail in finance? Obviously, also, and usually those projects are actually much larger.
Right.
But China does give these friendship hospitals, friendship roads, friendship bridges, and it's building them all over the world, even now. So, I mean, that you can say that's part of the Belt and Road Initiative, or you can just say that's part of their foreign policy.
Right.
But whatever you say, it's a positive thing for a developing country to have. Imagine you're in Bangladesh, and we're talking about the eighth bridge because I was just researching it the other day.
Mhm.
On both sides of the bridge, you have different townships, but they're not really able to trade with one another well. They have to use ferries. It could take hours to load your things on the ferries and then move across and then unload the ferry on the other side. The increase in economic activity between the two sides of this river is actually increasing prosperity for all the people. This is beside exporting things, besides the economic activity that comes from other aspects of the development aid. It just helps the people that are there.
So, Jason, I think what's important to understand here is the different approach between China and the United States. And I always like to link it back to that analogy of if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. But if you if you teach a man how to fish, you're going to feed him for a lifetime. And it's different because if you look specifically at the continent of Africa, the United States actually does provide a lot of aid to Africa. But a lot of what that means is a lot of it is, for example, we'll go and we'll deliver water. We will deliver food. We'll deliver, we'll go and bring a team of doctors there and they'll do some minor surgeries, whether it's on eyes or maybe the cleft lip surgery, things like that. These are all positive things that the United States is certainly doing. And there's a lot of aid that is going, but it's more looked at as kind of like a charity. You know what? We're going to just go ahead and donate this stuff. We're going to donate a couple $100 million worth of aid to Africa. They need our help. Here's some help. There you go. Now, the problem is that obviously water, food, a surgery, these are great things, but they're all very temporary. And once that is out, it's out. And then guess what? You're right back where you started. And now you're going to need more water and you're going to need more food. And so I think what's interesting is that over the turn, the United States historically has neglected a very large part of the world. You mentioned it earlier, the global South. Well, the global South, for people that don't know, this is basically everybody outside of, the Western allies of the United States. So, we're not talking, basically U.S., Canada, and the European Union, sprinkle in Japan, Australia, New Zealand. That's basically the West. And everywhere else is the global South. Well, interesting enough, that other part, the global South, is actually around 88% of the world's population. So a better term for that would probably be the global majority, because that's really what is being addressed here. So we're looking at the entire regions of Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. These are countries that are not represented in this Western bloc. And historically, they have been neglected by the United States and Western allies. So this is where China has come in, and they've done a very interesting thing. One of the amazing things is that when you look at a very tiny country, let's just say the Solomon Islands, okay? The Solomon Islands, very tiny country. The United States has historically had zero interest in developing diplomacy, diplomatic relations. We have no interest in the Solomon Islands at all. So much to the fact that, for example, in the Solomon Islands, there's still a lot of landmines and a lot of bombs left over from World War II. I mean, we're talking 80 years later, there's still people dying in the Solomon Islands because they accidentally step on a landmine or they step on an old bomb that's 80 years old. And this was a priority. They said, hey, come in here and clean up all this garbage, and the United States government's like, it's not that important to us. It's so low on the priority list, it's never going to get done. But this is where China comes in and sees an opportunity. So it doesn't matter if you're a major economy, let's say Germany, or you're the Solomon Islands. If you are the prime minister of Solomon Islands, or you are the prime minister of Germany, or the chancellor, as they call it in Germany, and you fly to Beijing for a diplomatic meeting, you're getting the same treatment. You're getting the red carpets being rolled out. You're going to have the official diplomatic welcome. And that is a very stark difference between the United States and China. So China is really treating all countries, regardless of their size, whether they're super tiny Solomon Islands in the Asia Pacific region, or if they're a big country like Germany, you're basically getting the same treatment. In addition to that, China is seeing this as an opportunity, saying, look, Africa is a very large untapped resource. It is an absolutely, arguably the wealthiest continent in the world, given its incredible amount of resources. Now, does China want those resources? Of course they do. Of course they're interested in, building and gaining access to all these minerals and things. For example, you look at the EV industry that China is absolutely dominant in. So many of those, the zinc and the cobalt and all the minerals and metals that are required to make an EV battery. Well, many of them come from Africa, and China is building these relationships to get access to that, and that is why they built this incredible supply chain. So, but what's happening is they're building roads, they're building airports, and now all of a sudden these African countries and smaller cities, they have a chance to get out, right? They have a chance to break that cycle of poverty. And that's going back to the analogy of teaching a man to fish, because now all of a sudden you have a road, you have an airport, you have a port. Now you can start actually making products, you can start exporting things, you can actually legit run a business, as opposed to just being in the middle of nowhere with no access to the outside world. How are you going to develop? How are you going to break that cycle of poverty? And so that's a very different model, I think, between the United States and China, one that is often overlooked. And I just want to go back to your last comment where you said this debt trap diplomacy. This is the kind of the three biggest words you'll hear from Western news outlets in regards to the BRI. But the lady from Johns Hopkins, Deborah Brodiger, Dr. Deborah Brodiger, she wrote an amazing article, and she's been very clear on that. This is wrong. There's absolutely zero evidence that suggests this. And there's no, like you said, there's never been a single incident in the 12 years of the Belt and Road Initiative that China's ever taken over an asset because somebody's defaulted on their loan. So it's not some predatory scheme from China for them to, they're going to come in and we're going to give you a loan. Oh, guess what? You can't repay it. Well, we're taking over everything in your country. We're going to dominate you now. That's just not China. That's not how their foreign policy works. And I just wanted to establish that fact. But that is kind of the overall difference between the United States and China and their approach to foreign policy, Jason.
Well, I want to add to what you said, because everything you touched upon, I think, is completely correct. But there's also other pieces that we can add to the way in which China is facilitating development in these countries. So one of the things that China really has emphasized is development of power. And a lot of that has been hydropower, but also fossil fuel emitting mediums up until about 2018, 2019. Now it's pretty much all solar and hydro and wind and so forth. But what really that facilitates is in-house development of finished products. So factories there in those countries, for the last several hundred years under colonialism from Europe, and then to some degree the United States, we have been taking resources from those countries, developing them in our countries, and then selling them back at a considerably marked up price.
Right.
But now a lot of developing countries are finishing the products themselves in-house and then exporting those finished products to the rest of the world. Now, another thing, that in a way that China benefits from having all of these countries have these roads and ports and airports, seaports, land bridges, rail, all of this stuff, is that China, as these countries become more economically prosperous, they also want to import and buy a lot of advanced goods. Guess where most of the stuff in the world is made?
Exactly.
China. China is developing their economies to create middle class to buy Chinese goods. So China is importing their goods and exporting goods. It's a win-win. It's a win for the developing country, who has a more prosperous country, and they have a much more powerful economy, and people are better off. Quality of life is improving, and China is able to sell them goods. Chinese exports to the developing world have outpaced to the developed world. So we're primarily talking about the G7. So the developing world is now buying more Chinese products than the G7 is, which basically means, like, if the United States wants to put 104% tariffs on Chinese EVs, it doesn't hurt China that bad, because China can still sell those EVs in Europe and in Africa and in the Middle East and South America and all these other places. So increasingly, like, some of the trade war stuff that's happening is not affecting China in the same way that the United States, I think some of the leaders in Washington were hoping it was going to.
Correct.
So I'm a little, I actually also think the United States benefits immensely from the Belt and Road Initiative. So because all of these developing countries now have economies that want to import things, guess what? They want to import Marvel movies too. So
Yeah.
like American products are also going to be popular in these developing economies. So China, by helping develop the underdeveloped world, is benefiting Europe. It's benefiting the United States. So Americans are benefiting from the Belt and Road Initiative inadvertently, indirectly, by the global economy becoming larger and becoming more powerful. So I really don't understand always why the United States is like, no, 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 you should only just trade with us. We're your only buddy. When
Exactly.
these developing countries trade with more partners, that creates more economic activity, which benefits everyone. Another thing about, you mentioned United States likes to send waters, food, and that kind of aid. Absolutely, it does. And China does that too, but China actually doesn't do it unless there's an emergency usually.
Right.
China, if there's, for example, there was a volcano erupted in Tonga 2019, I want to say. I might have the exact year wrong,
Right.
but China sent 2 ships full of aid, water, power generators, tents, sleeping bags, food, etc. China does that too, but primarily around, some sort of like, what do they call it in the insurance business? Act of God. So there'll be
Oh, yeah,
some
yeah.
earthquake or some
Right.
volcano, and so China jumps to that. But in terms of like the rest of its development aid, oftentimes it takes the form of aid that develops, going along with your teach a man to fish metaphor.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think that's what you're seeing right now, Jason, with the United States and with China, is that there's just a different approach. And, the United States, they very much are wanting to be that global hegemonic power. They really want to make sure that they can go back and maintain that unipolar world. And in the United States, it always comes down to this, is the fact that you'll hear this being preached that, well, the United States, we have the values, right? We have we're based on the rules-based, the rules-based order. We're a liberal democracy. And if you follow our lead, that's going to be a more safer and a better, system for the world. And, the world is better when America leads. We've actually taken that policy even further where, our Secretary of State, famously, our former Secretary of State, Michael Pompeo, he said, the best policy for Europe, the best foreign policy for Europe is an American first policy, because if America's first, then you guys will be better. And the issue with this is that, what we're seeing in real time is we're seeing a very big issue with this because of what's happening, for example, on the battlefield in Ukraine. For example, because Europe relies heavily on America for security, right? There's always, it's kind of a double-edged sword for Europe. In one sense, your security partner is the United States. Well, that's a great security partner, right? We have the biggest military in the world, so we spend trillions of dollars on it every year. If you're Germany and France, it's great that you know that you have the United States, backing you, and that no one's going to military invade you because the U.S. has your back. That's great. But in exchange for that, you now sacrifice some of your freedom because, for example, when the United States was pushing Ukraine towards NATO membership, at the time, France and Germany's, leadership both said, look, we don't think this is good for us. But guess what? The United States says, I don't care what you think. This is what we want. You're following along. So now you have to go against your best interest and you have to appease the United States. And again, it's everything is, as long as America's first, as long as America is the best, this is what's going to happen. We're actually seeing this play out in real time when we're looking at Russia and China. So, Vladimir Putin just traveled to Beijing 2 weeks ago. They have issued a very big statement. In many ways, this was much more significant than the 2022 statement, where they said there are no limits to this partnership. And what they basically said is here's our new plan moving forward. We are going to be more strategically linked together. But one of the key things they said in that, which kind of ties this all in together, Jason, is they said, one of the key things that we want to preach is that every country around the world should be able to develop in the way that best suits them and their citizens. And that's a really big point. And I think that's a very important point because not every single country in the world is going to follow this United States style of a liberal democracy. And in fairness, you and I are both American. We can look at our country and we can look at the state of democracy in the United States in 2024. It's an absolute mess. It's an absolute mess. It's a gong show. And the United States democracy has never been weaker than it is right now. And we are now just months away from a very pivotal election that I don't know a single American who is optimistic or bullish about. Again, it seems to be another case of a choice between bad and bad. Who are you going to choose? The lesser of two evils. It's not really a great time for America to be, hey guys, you should be embracing our liberal democracy. Really? Like what you want to embrace what's going on in your country right now? So, again, it kind of comes to the point where I always preach, Jason, is that the United States, we've got to look internally. We've got to clean up our house. We've got to really, be, if we really want to be, and again, it's not me being anti-democracy. I think democracy is a great form of government, and it certainly exists in the world, and it is, it's very beneficial for many countries. But I am very much in agreement with Russia and China in the sense that that should not be for every country, and every country should develop in the way that is best suited for them. So I would agree with them in that statement. And again, that's kind of what you're seeing with the Belt and Road, kind of tying this all back together where, for example, one of the things that China does is they will never interfere in your domestic politics. So if you're a dictator, if you're a socialist country, if you're democratic, if you're Nazi, I mean, honestly, it's like, you know what, you do you. By the way, do you want to do this trade? I'd like to build a bridge there. That way we can do some more commerce together. Kind of whatever government you have, sort it out yourselves. That's for you and your people to figure out. We're just really kind of looking at this from an economic perspective. And that's what really China goes into Africa. And a lot of people have said, China's very good at doing business because it said, hey, you provide A, we'll provide B. A, B. That's what we're interested in. All this other nonsense, I don't really care about. And we kind of see a very different approach from the United States, where, for example, I think it was Uganda, they had passed a law that is, what the United States government officials had said is like a anti-gay law. And they say, hey, Uganda, if you're not going to get on board with this LGBT policies of the United States, we're going to sanction you. We're going to sanction you and we're going to restrict your access to the US dollar. So now you have a thing where, it's even beyond governmental thing. And now it's kind of going to ideologies. And again, that's, it's just interesting how we're trying to export our way of thinking and our way of life to other countries around the world. And again, this is something that China and Russia would certainly not do. They would simply go more from an economic perspective. Hey, Uganda, let's do a trade deal. Let's build a bridge. Let's build a port. Let's build a road, whatever we need to build to facilitate more trade. That's what we're going to do.
I want to add to that because I want to talk about the way World Bank and IMF actually work. Because I'm not like someone who thinks we should not have World Bank or IMF. I'm not that radical. But there is something called the Washington Consensus in the World Bank in the way that loans are dispersed. So they'll go to a country and they'll say, hey, you want to build a bridge? It's going to increase your economic activity. Great. That's going to cost $2 billion. Great. We're going to loan you $2 billion in 10 tranches. And each tranche, you need to follow the Washington Consensus. As you are implementing this consensus, we will give you each, section of the loan for you to eventually finish the bridge. Right. In each tranche, they will do things like you need to liberalize your banks so that people can move money in and out of your country. You need to sell off some of your national assets. So currently you have your rail. It's a national asset. We don't like that. It's not good for your economy. We know best. You have to now privatize your rail system. You need to privatize this national forest. You need to privatize this set of, national assets over here. So by the end, if you keep following each tranche and following the Washington Consensus, the goal of the World Bank and IMF is to create an economy which is not national at all. It's right. as little nationalized as possible. The consequence of that for a poor nation very often, almost always, is very rich Western companies from the United States and Europe and their allies come in and buy everything up and then make it impossible for that country to actually attain wealth. The purpose of building the bridge is now going to be to facilitate Western companies exploiting your country. Now, they say it's not intended to do that. It's intended to create the market realities necessary to create growth. But it usually does not work. And for the last 80 years, since the end of World War II, since these tools were created, almost none of the countries that have followed the Washington Consensus have benefited. We're talking about China's policy of non-intervention in the countries that it does business with. Firstly, number one, China wants to do business with everyone.
Correct.
China wants to do business so bad with the United States, even though the United States is making that difficult. China wants to do business with Russia. China wants to do business with Germany. China wants to do business with Japan. With anyone who wants to do business, China's like, let's do business in some shape or form. But what it won't do when it's giving these loans or conducting business or giving aid is interfere in the internal affairs of those countries, just as you've outlined. One of the main purposes is to give countries the ability to maintain their national assets. Because for a particular country in its development path, maybe not selling off its national assets could be good for its own perspective of how it's going to develop economically, as opposed to having to take loans that it desperately needs from World Bank and then sell off, privatize a bunch of its assets. It can take loans from China and maintain those assets and get the same interest rate. It's like, okay, you're offering 2%, you're offering 2%, but
Right.
Washington is telling me I have to privatize a bunch of things I don't want to privatize. Clearly, those countries are going to turn to China and take those loans instead because they don't interfere with the political system, with the economic system that those people have imagined for themselves. And so that's a huge difference between the way that World Bank is doing things and the way that the BRI and AIIB is doing things. And part of the reason that can't change in World Bank is the United States maintains 15% control over World Bank. And because it founded World Bank, it takes 15%, the magic number, to maintain veto power over anything World Bank can
Exactly.
do. So then Washington maintains control over how World Bank is functioning. China
Right.
originally went to World Bank and said, we're going to invest in World Bank. We want to help develop the developing world. But they very quickly realized the United States would never let go of that 15%, would never let go of veto power over all of the other countries which have invested in the World Bank. And that's why it created AIIB and these other tools and instruments to invest in the developing world without interfering in the internal affairs of those countries.
Yeah, it's a great point, Jason, and it's so important to understand because when you're looking at the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of it, like the opening statement, this is China's key foreign policy initiative around the globe, and as a result of that, it really does a lot to deal with geopolitics. And so what we're seeing is with the United States, it goes back to that unipolar world, and now we're living in the multipolar world. And there has never been a more clear shift to this multipolar world. There actually is no shift anymore. The multipolar world is here. It is the unipolar world is dead. We now live in the multipolar world. So that's an important thing to understand. And exactly like you've said, for these many reasons, the United States has always been seen as this aggressor. It is always seen as very dominant, and it's always America first, right? Whatever business deal you're getting into, America's got to be the winner. It's got to be in our strategic interest. It exactly goes back to that policy with Michael Pompeo saying, hey, Germany, you know what's in your best interest is if you put our best interest first. That's what's best for you. And that's one of the things that I really learned about in Canada. I lived in Canada for 5 years, and one of the things that I really disliked about the Canadian government is that, yes, we have an incredible relationship with the United States. We're basically brothers or cousins. We have one of the largest land borders between the U.S. and Canada. We're number one trading partners with each other. We've always, what a great partner for Canada to have. The United States as really the only country in the world that borders you. So you're great. You're militarily protected. You can do trade with a superpower. It's great. But as a result of that, Canada gets bullied by the United States in foreign policy, and Canada always has to follow. And I just simply said, why don't you guys? And I simply said, why don't you make a stand for what's best for Canada? Because sometimes you do need to stand up. And the reality is what is the United States going to do? Are they going to sanction you? Are they going to cut off trade to you? Are they going to get mad at you? At the end of the day, and we saw this play out in real time with the whole Meng Wanzhou, arrest that was a huge deal in Canada for the better part of 2.5, almost 3 years, where Canada, the prime minister could have came in and ended that overnight. He could have just said, you know what, we're going to go ahead and release her. We don't want to be caught in the middle of this ordeal. But they didn't, and it dragged on and on and on. And as a result, many Canadians just were very frustrated that their relationship with China was being dragged down and that they were caught in the middle of this geopolitical crossfire. And I said, hey, this is a great example of when you guys can just step up and say, hey, enough is enough. We're doing what's in our best interest. And so I think there's a big story there, and this is a big reason why China continues to giving these loans. Countries around the world continue to work with China. And again, if I'm the prime minister of a smaller developing country, I'm absolutely going to do business with both. But I'm certainly going to tell the United States, hey, I'm open to do business with you, but it's not in your position to criticize, me and say I can only do business with you. Guess what? The multipolar world is here. Guess what? China is a superpower now. They have a seat at the table and they've earned it and they get it. Because why? Because they're the number one trading partner with 120 countries around the world. They have incredible leverage. And guess what? Most of the products we use every single day, look at our computers, our cameras that we're using right now, the microphones, all this is coming from China. Our cell phones, all of it's coming from China. We want to lead the world in green technology. We want to stop this, the global warming and this huge threat of carbon emissions. Guess who's leading the world in green technology? It's China. And they're doing an incredible job. I mean, you live in Beijing. I mean, you've seen that firsthand. I mean, just how different that was. I mean, I was in Beijing in 2007. Very different. Excuse me, with dry. I was in Beijing in 2007. Completely different with the pollution, vastly different, and China's done a great job on that. Large part of that has become green technology.
I want to talk about a company called Illuminate USA. And this is in Ohio, and this is a JV, a joint venture with a Chinese company. So what's
Nice.
fascinating is the United States is trying to maintain, some manufacturing inside the United States in key sectors. And so a Chinese company actually has moved. It's called Longi. It's the largest solar manufacturing company in the world. Has moved into the United States and set up a factory for 1,000 workers in Columbus, Ohio. US workers, for US workers to make solar in the US for the US market. And actually, I think maybe this is the kind of compromise that could work with the United States, so long as the United States, and I have to say, doesn't steal this. Because if you look like TikTok and you look at Huawei, the United
Right.
States tried to steal a lot of Chinese technology that was in the United States. And so if the United States allows this JV to produce solar panels for the US market, there may be future investments where JVs can come, joint ventures can come into the United States and set up factories, hire American workers. I mean, factory jobs are the best kind of jobs that for Americans. They're usually very high paying. They come with great
Right.
benefits. So if Chinese joint ventures can come into the United States and set up factories where Americans can work and make things in America for Americans, I think that there is a lot of benefit there. In terms of solar, I do want to talk about it to a really large extent. I think the United States, big oil companies are terrified of China's immense ability to manufacture solar, wind, offshore and onshore, because one of the major exports the United States has gas and oil. And the United States is one of the largest consumers and producers of oil in the entire world. So it does kind of make sense that Biden is like, we don't want Chinese EVs coming to the United States. Why? Because if regular Americans can afford EVs, then the big oil companies, the big oil lobby are not going to be able to make money and influence politics. So the United States is kind of shutting itself off from Chinese EVs, from Chinese solar. And I think that's not to the United States' benefit, because the countries that we're talking about, the developing countries around the world, they are building out solar, and because it's so affordable now, it's more affordable to go with solar than almost any other
Hmm.
kind of energy now. And it's not perfect because it doesn't work at night. And so you have to have battery technology, or you have to have water that moves up and down hills, or you have to have these
Right.
gravity storage facilities. And so, but it does actually help during the day. It does help for a lot of things. And it does help, we're talking about diversifying how you invest. You can diversify your energy grid. So if 20 or 30 or 40% is made up of solar and 20 or 30% is made up of wind, then that can, mostly electrify a lot of countries. If you look at Laos, 2004, had 40% electrification. 2020, Laos had 100% electrification.
Wow.
How did it do it? It did
Amazing.
that with China. China came in and started building hydropower dams all over Laos. And now Laos is, 100% electrification. I think this scares the United States and investors in the United States and big companies in the United States that are in these old big oil, big gas companies, because if countries around the world no longer need to import oil and gas, or at least not nearly as much, that's going to hurt their profit margin. So I think that's a big frustration for them with China and the pretend word overcapacity. Overcapacity literally means you're making more than the market can absorb, more than people will buy. But countries around the world are buying all of it. And China installed in 2023 as much solar as the rest of the world combined in 2022. So, I
Right.
mean, China is just rolling this out really fast, but countries are absorbing it everywhere. The real problem isn't overcapacity. The real problem for the United States and for these big companies is the fossil fuel emitting fuels that we make are no longer as viable in the market because countries no longer need as much of it.
That's right. Well, and I want to just add something really important for everybody to understand is that Laos, let's not forget the history here. It is also the most bombed country in the world. Okay, over 2 million tons of bombs have been dropped by the United States on Laos, during the Vietnam War, basically, and trying to turn that country from communist forces. So you look at a kind of a stark difference there, because Laos, for example, it has that fact of being the most bombed country in the world, led by the United States government. And now you look at this incredible fact that you just said, Jason, from 2004, to last year, gone from, what was it, 40% to 100%. A lot of that's done with China. And I think the overcapacity myth, I mean, this is certainly the most trending word about China in the last 3 weeks, is everyone's talking about overcapacity. They're flooding the market. It's not fair, all of these things. But you're right. I mean, the simple fact is that all of these items are being exported around the world. And it's interesting, I just installed solar in my house here in Las Vegas, and because it is significantly cheaper, and it is it's going to be great for us in the long term. Mathematically it works out much better. It's also better for the environment. But I'm glad that I did it before these new tariffs come in, because what's interesting is that Joe Biden doesn't realize is that, the person that's going to get hurt the most from these tariffs is actually the American consumer. We're going to have to get hammered on that, because guess what? We're still going to buy it because China leads the technology, right? So now you're just making it more expensive for everybody. And at the end of the day, it's the American consumer that loses out on all of these tariffs. So it's really a very short-sighted move from the Biden administration, and it's something that does not benefit the United States in any way either. So very sad to see that, but that is this battle between the United States and China that we're currently seeing.
I recently was looking at some African countries are really starting to take up some of the slack in importing EVs. So the United States, there are several reasons the United States doesn't do well with EVs, and part of that is the charging infrastructure. China
Right.
has as much
Right.
charging infrastructure as pretty much the rest of the world combined plus. So that's not.
Right.
In the United States is a car country, so we don't have high speed rail in the United States. So we want cars. So if we're going to buy EVs, we need it to be convenient. Consumers needed to make it convenient. And one of the differences that between China and the United States is China built out the infrastructure well before the market demand. In the United States, we have a different system. So we want the market forces to build that out for us. So the United States government did not centrally plan all of the charging stations. So they're not really there because we can't have the demand and the cars at the same time. It's actually very complicated, but China built it all out. And then guess what? 1% of US drivers have EVs.
Right.
50% of Chinese cars on the roads now are EVs. And that's not including fleets of buses and taxis.
That's right.
So that is absolutely remarkable. I walk around and I actually look at the license plates here in Beijing, because the old license plates are blue. And that
Right.
means,
Right.
fossil fuel car. And the new license plates are green. And it's just like about balanced in Beijing. It's like about half of the cars are green. And you mentioned earlier about the sky. The sky is blue,
Yeah.
almost all the time. Sometimes we get a sandstorm from Mongolia, or yes, the pollution is there every now and then, but it's mostly just blue sky days all the time. 2012, when I arrived here, blue sky days were, kind of a special occasion,
Right.
but now it's like, completely different. And I know the United States doesn't have the same problem that China had 10 years ago, but it certainly would help, the world and global warming and all of these things. And the US consumers, imagine buying an affordable EV in the United States. I actually just took a trip to Shanxi from Beijing. It was 6 hours, and my wife and I went with this other couple. We stopped to charge one time on our way to Shanxi, and then that was it. And it
Yeah.
took about 20 minutes to charge, maybe 30 minutes to charge. And then
Nice.
we went,
Nice.
all the way to Shanxi. It's 2 provinces away, and then all the way back to Beijing the next day. And it was just on that one charge. So the technology is there. It's comparable to fossil fuel emitting vehicles. It's just we don't have the 104%. Who pays this is the American consumer. And that's what you mentioned.
Yeah.
These tariffs, most Americans don't like taxes. This is something we all can get behind. I mean, obviously, the Republicans hate taxes way more, but people don't like being taxed. Tariffs are a hidden tax. So you go to buy something that has been produced in another country with tariffs on it. The tax is invisible in the price. It's not that country that pays that tax. China's not paying any more to export EVs to the United States. It's
That's right.
the
That's right.
American consumer, but paying an invisible tax on something that has already been taxed as it was being imported into the United States. And then you have to pay, guess what? Taxes on that. That's insane.
It is insane, and I think the other thing that's difficult as well is I want to bring up this story. This is quite interesting, Jason. Is the fact that in order for you to get better, you need competition. And one of the most incredible things that China ever did was the government got behind the EV industry. They started handing out subsidies. And what they did not do is they did not say that the subsidies are only for Chinese companies. They said it's open to anyone. Well, what happened? Elon Musk and Tesla went to China and they received those subsidies as well. This is why they built the Shanghai Gigafactory. And 50% of the Teslas around the world are coming from that Shanghai Gigafactory. But what was interesting with that is that at the time, Tesla was very innovative. It was very much ahead of, pretty much the number one EV car. But because China welcomed Tesla into that ecosystem, now all of China can start learning from Tesla, and they can start competing with Tesla, and they can really start saying, hey, we've got Tesla and Elon Musk, the real leaders in EVs, but we're going to start developing our own. But because of welcoming in that competition, it actually inspired more innovation. And now what's also interesting is because Tesla is so ingrained in that ecosystem, it's almost impossible for them to leave, right? How is Tesla going to, get out of China? They're not. They're going to be there for the long term. So again, it's still, this is something that Elon Musk would certainly agree with and that he understands is that competition actually breeds innovation. And, there is room for many EV companies in there. But I mean, you look at what is happening with BYD, with NIO, with XPeng, all of these, and a plethora more of EV companies. There's incredible innovation coming from China. And that's something that the United States doesn't want to do. We don't want to innovate. We don't want to compete. We'd rather sanction you. We'd rather boycott you. We would rather, induce tariffs. And basically, we want to contain you. And that's what we've seen with, microchips. We've seen with all of these technologies is it's, very much the United States trying to contain China's rise, which inevitably will just inspire China to work harder and faster and innovate even at a quicker rate.
I think you're absolutely right. What's interesting in terms of the development of the underdeveloped world, the global south, is China is not just trying to contain them. So the United States is trying to contain China, but China is actually building schools and universities, and some of them are free. So I'm just going to go over a couple of examples here. China donated an $11.94 million school, International Language and Cultural Center for Kenyatta University. In Kenya and Ethiopia, China donated 2 friendship schools. So China is actually helping. I think everyone knows about China's 7,000 school project for Iraq. So this is in exchange for
Right.
oil. So the schools for oil program. So you don't have to worry about the economics of it. You export this X amount of oil to us. We're going to build you 7,000 schools. Now, I remember that the United States, after the invasion, after 2003, said we are going to help rebuild Iraq. But that didn't really happen. Now, China is actually rebuilding Iraq. So I think that is a really important story to tell. And I think this is concerning because we're Americans. Our job as Americans in our culture to be American is to be critical of our own government. That is
Correct.
a very American attribute. And when I look around the world, I see China building schools, China building hospitals, China building bridges, and the United States, honestly, arming people, arming conflicts, sending weapons, building bases. The view from a global perspective, not just from within the United States, but outside of the United States, the view is China builds and the United States bombs. And this is bad for the United States. This is not the image that the United States should be projecting. So, I mean, I'm hopeful, I'm hoping that the United States sees, we're talking about competition, a different kind
Right.
of competition, a competition for hearts and minds that China is currently winning. The
Right.
United States, maybe it's time to up their game. Maybe the United States should either join BRI or start doing similar kinds of developing projects around the world. And you see the State Department issuing, statements to countries, oh, we don't want you to work with China. That's not going to work. What the United States needs to do is the same kind of development. And this would be the kind of world, that even China talks about working together to build a shared future for all humanity. This is exactly something the United States should step into. It's not a trap. The United States can step in and also do these kinds of life changing projects. I mean, we still live in a world where there is starvation, where there still
Right.
is UN defined absolute poverty, where people
Yeah.
are living on less than $1 a day. We can transform that. The United States is, according to some measurements, still the greatest economy in the world. Imagine if we were doing the same kinds of things that China is doing in the developing world. That would be good for the US image, but it would also be good for humanity. It's also just the right thing to do. So when I see the Belt and Road Initiative, I'm like, that touches my heart. But I also hope that our country, the United States, can do something similar.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you, Jason. It's been a fascinating chat with you, because I think what I hope this podcast does is that I hope it allows people to understand a little bit more perspective of what China is doing in the world and the opportunity that the United States has. But I guess the big takeaway here is that we are in a multipolar world. The United States and China are both superpowers. They will continue to be so. But I agree with you. I think it's amazing what has happened in the Belt and Road Initiative. Again, it's the cornerstone of China's foreign policy. It will continue to be so. And it's going to be interesting to see how China continues to develop around the world and continuing to make allies and friends. And what I think is amazing is looking at these smaller developing countries as really great opportunities, right? It's like a chance of investing in a new startup, right? You can invest early, and over the long term you can make a lot of money, because you're investing early. And there's potential in these younger countries that are still developing, and that really is where the future of the world is these emerging economies. And so if China's there, they're going to win over the long term.
Thank you so much for your time, Cyrus.
My pleasure, Jason. Thanks so much. Always a pleasure to join you, buddy.
Likewise.
All right.